So with that, let's just start with sort of something you've already alluded to. Let's explain what it is, talk about how much it matters, and then kind of get into some examples. So let's start with a term that many people have heard before, but I don't think most people understand what VO2 max really means. And eventually we're going to talk about running efficiency and lactate threshold, and we're going to get into all of this stuff. But let's make sure people understand what VO2 max is, both in an absolute term and then in a manner that we normalize it by weight, and what it is and what it isn't, how it's measured, how it matters, and maybe we'll even talk about some notable exceptions.
So VO2 max is the one physiological parameter that anyone who's involved in endurance has heard of and has some sense of. The first order analogy is it's kind of the size of your engine. Physiologically, VO2 max is telling you how quickly you can take oxygen from the air into your lungs, get it into your blood, pump it to your muscles, and then have your muscles use it in the metabolic processes that will provide energy to move you to do whatever you want to do. So it's a rate. It's how much oxygen per unit time can you process absolutely flat out. Now, the sort of backstory here is it was first sort of discussed or measured in the 1920s by a guy named A.V. Hill, who was actually a very good runner. The observation that he made is if you have someone, you ask someone to go out and run at a gentle pace, they'll consume, let's say, 2 liters of oxygen per minute. Then you tell them to speed up. Now they're doing 3 liters of oxygen per minute. You tell them to speed up again. And now they're going pretty much, maybe not as fast as they can, but they're going fast. And they're using 4 liters of oxygen per minute. And so you tell them to speed up again. And you measure it and you're like, oh, they're only using 4 liters of oxygen a minute, just like last time. So speed up again. And they're still just using 4 liters of oxygen a minute. There's a plateau. There's a point at which, even though you're working harder, you're not using any more oxygen. And so this plateau looks like it's a physiological limitation. And it probably is in some sense. It's a controversial thing. But basically, you've reached a point where no matter how hard you push yourself, you can't get more oxygen. And so you can still go faster because you're starting to use other forms of energy. But this is the limits of your aerobic system. This tells you what it tells you. We can get into. It's not clear what it tells you. It tells you exactly what I just said. It tells you how much oxygen you can use. Does that tell you exactly how fast you can run? No, there are a lot of other factors, but that tells you what sort of aerobic engine you have to play with.
I remember in high school, we would sort of talk about, well, which athletes have the highest VO2 max? Is it the Norwegian cross-country skiers? Is it the professional runners and cyclists and things like that? But people are usually used to hearing these numbers reported not in liters per minute, but in milliliters per minute per kilogram. So give an example so people understand those differences, because we usually talk about the outliers as a number that's a bigger number than 2 liters or 5 liters. It would be, sort of 75, 80 milliliters per. Just explain to people how those are different.
Sure. So I'll use my own numbers. Typically when I was tested, I could get about a little bit more than 5 liters per minute. So 5.1, 5.2, if I remember correctly. Now, if you compared me to a rower, the rower would make me look pathetic because the rower would be using 7 liters a minute or more. But the rower is also huge, twice my size or whatever. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that rower is better at using oxygen per minute because the rower has way more muscle. And so the rower the amount of oxygen reaching any given muscle cell may be lower. So if you want to compare apples to apples between athletes of different sizes, you divide, at least for a crude approximation, you just divide by weight. And so the numbers we usually hear are, rather than liters of oxygen per minute, it's milliliters of oxygen per minute per kilogram of body weight. So for me, 5 liters of oxygen per minute works out to something like 80 milliliters of oxygen per minute per kilogram of body weight. There's a whole rabbit hole to go into is to say, well, why are we dividing by whole body weight? Because, there's a bunch of things like skeleton and organs and stuff that don't scale.
The adipose tissue doesn't matter. You could argue a better comparison would be total liters per minute divided by lean mass divided by time, or normalized to time. And then you're at least getting the metabolically active tissue, presumably.
Yeah. And there's papers where they do things like, let's divide by weight to the power of 0.68 or 0.7, which is another way of getting, effectively, it's a way of approximating just the lean mass, the metabolically active tissue. And you can go down that rabbit hole, but I suspect you'll want to get to is it's like at a certain point, it doesn't matter that much anyway. So we don't need to, you can't just measure someone's VO2 max and know how fast they're going to race. So it's useful, but it's not, especially for comparing between people. Now, comparing within yourself, it tells you something if you've increased or if your VO2 max has decreased. But in that sense, it doesn't matter what you're dividing by.
I remember there was a guy that I used to ride with, and this was not that long ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago when I was still, somewhat competitive, at least with myself. Actually, it's funny. My number was just like yours, except I was heavier. So I was about 5.1 to 5.2 liters, but I weighed more. So that worked out to about 70 mils per mg per kg was my VO2 max. His was 55 to 60, but there was never a day that I could ride faster than him. Not one. There's simply, and I always felt like, although we did the test so many times, I kept feeling like the machine must have been broken on him. Like I knew my 70 was about right because I'd been tested so much and that was lower than it had been when I was younger. So it seemed appropriate. But I was always convinced that there's no way he's only 55. The reality of it is he may well have been, and he may have simply been a far more efficient athlete, which we're going to get into. Before we get to the story of Oscar Svensson, let's talk a little bit about historically what people have believed the limits are of VO2 max.
We don't even have to go very far historically to get into a whole mudslide of confusion and debate and disagreement. There's a lot of places along the way that could, in some circumstances, be the bottleneck. Normally, people tend to assume that what is it that causes VO2 max to plateau is essentially what we're talking about. And just one thing I should add here, it's like, why is that interesting? It's because you think, well, if you want to measure endurance, just have someone run a mile or whatever, as hard as they can. But any test like that depends on motivation, depends on whether you pace it right. There's all these factors that come into it. The nice thing about VO2 max is that in theory, it's independent of motivation. That's why scientists like it, because it doesn't matter if the subject doesn't really care about the study. If you see a plateau, that's a property of their body and not a product of whether they were excited about the study. So the question is, this plateau, what is it that causes it? And it could be in the lungs, it could be the heart, it could be the circulation, it could be the muscle's ability to extract it. I don't want to pretend that I know the answer because it's still controversial. The picture that emerges is that almost every part along this cascade is engineered more or less to what it needs to be. And so if you perturb any of those elements, you can get limitations. So for example, the conventional wisdom is that your lungs are not a limitation. You can always breathe enough in. And so then the question is, can you diffuse enough oxygen from your lungs into your bloodstream and so on and so forth? There are situations where, and it's been for decades, it's been conventional wisdom that the lungs don't respond to training because they're overbuilt. There was just a paper published, a big review in the last month or two, arguing that, in some cases, the lungs aren't overbuilt. And one of the situations is highly trained endurance athletes. They can be limited by their ability to get enough oxygen in. And you can also run into situations where an athlete is so fit, their heart is so strong, it pumps blood past your lungs so quickly that it doesn't have time to fully stock up on oxygen. You get something called exercise-induced arterial hypoxemia. So this is usually an issue at altitude, but in elite endurance athletes is actually about half of them exhibited even at sea level. So they're already running into a limitation just in getting oxygen from their lungs to their bloodstream. And then at every stage of the way, there can be limitations if anything is knocked off kilter. And certainly right down to the ability of the muscles to first extract the oxygen from the bloodstream and then to make use of it metabolically in the mitochondria. So there isn't one single answer, which is why you get these debates, because everyone is I have evidence that this is the limit. It's like, yeah, but I have evidence that this is the limit and that's the limit, and they're all the limit.
Yeah, I've always wanted to see the experiment where you took a group of athletes, and maybe this has been done. You run them all to max, and then you reduce the FiO2 of the incoming oxygen. So normally we do it with room air. So you're getting the fractional inhalation of oxygen is 21%. And the way, of course, just for the listener, the way these things work is the way they're calculating how much oxygen is being consumed is they're measuring the concentration of oxygen on the way out. So you're calculating the delta. And so I've always thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting to start selectively dropping FiO2, 21%, 20%, 19%, 18%. Now, presumably, if the lungs aren't the limitation, you should still see the same absolute delta. And you could at least start to eliminate one of those variables, which would be FiO2 and capillary exchange. And then you start pointing to some of these other variables. Again, I'm sure somebody has done this experiment, but I don't know what it yielded.
Probably not with the fine tooth comb that you're suggesting. People have compared 21% to 10% or whatever, and 15%. I mean, it's interesting when you go to altitude, or the equivalent, when you reduce the amount of oxygen, funny things happen. Like the first thing you would think would happen is like, you can't get enough oxygen, so you're going to go anaerobic sooner, you're going to produce more lactate. And yet the opposite happens. There's something called the lactate paradox. If you try and exercise to exhaustion at lower levels of altitude, you actually give up when your lactate levels are lower than you would at sea level. And there's debate about what causes this and even whether it's a real thing. But the picture that makes sense to me is that these things are not just about how much oxygen is making it to the muscle. It's also like, what is your brain oxygen level? And so you're getting these other circuit breakers that are starting to come down that aren't even on this path from mouth to lungs to blood to muscle. There's other factors that are saying, whoa, wait a second, oxygen's getting a little low, so we're going to actually cut off the supply to the muscles or reduce it in order to make sure that we don't get stupid.